What do the most successful, growing businesses have in common? They're working together in Slack. Slack is where work happens, with all your people, data, and information in one AI-powered place. Grow your business in Slack. Visit slack.com to get started.
I'm Inc. Executive Editor Diana Ransom.
And I'm Editor-at-Large Christine Lagorio-Chafkin.
You're listening to From the Ground Up. Today's episode, The Evolution of Social Mission. This week, we're following up our discussion on mission-driven businesses with an interview from Vincent Stanley, Patagonia's Director of Philosophy.
Patagonia has been one of the most notable brands in environmentally responsible business practices and production for decades. They're an outdoors apparel and gear company that really sticks to its mission of making products that give back to the earth more than they take.
Yeah, remember that Don't Buy This Jacket ad?
Yeah, there was a full-page type of ad in the New York Times, is that right?
Yeah, it was just ahead of Black Friday. It was a zip-up jacket, and the ad basically said, don't buy this jacket.
So for a company that makes things that people ostensibly want to buy, that's a very anti-consumerism sentiment.
Totally. Very unexpected for a clothing brand, right? So I was curious to hear from someone who's been with the company pretty much from the beginning and seen years of evolution in terms of what it means to be a responsible company. Actually, The Responsible Company is the title of the book Vincent co-wrote with Patagonia's founder, Yvon Chouinard.
Vincent, it's nice to meet you. Can you actually walk us through what a director of philosophy even means and how you all aligned on that title?
Well, I made it up.
That's the best.
The background of this is that in the late 80s and 90s, when we were very successful, but a little bit directionless. We were launching product lines and abandoning them and hiring people rapidly without training them. And there was a certain point, I think, where Yvon Chouinard looked around and said, I'm building this very successful company that I don't want to work for, that I don't want to be involved with because it doesn't reflect the values I care about in terms of the environment and also in terms of doing business. And what he did was to take employees, 30 at a time, off to places like the Marin Headlands or Yosemite. We'd sit outside in a circle according to our function. The finance people went with finance and the sales people with sales, and hash out how is it that we want to do business. And then we wrote it up. 8 different functional, we call them philosophies, and those became the heart of 15 years later of Let My People Go Surfing. So when I stepped down from my operational responsibilities, the director of philosophy was a kind of intuitively chosen title. We don't have a big philosophy bureaucracy. It's just me teaching the classes with the help of a colleague.
And do you actually teach classes within Patagonia?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
A seminar style. And the function of the classes, because we have so much written down in Let My People Go Surfing, and then the 2 books that I work with Yvon on, the Responsible Company and Future, the Responsible Company. We have so much written down that I think it's important to actually keep those as living documents, to talk with the employees about how these values actually play out in the workplace. Because we place constraints on everyone. They're limited. They can't make unlimited choices. If I worked as a designer in a sportswear company, I could go to the FIT library in New York and choose from thousands of prints if I'm designing a spring line. In Patagonia, maybe a couple hundred that you can look at because we need to vet the social conditions in the mills and the environmental base of the environmental practices that went into making the fabric. So the idea of the classes, 12 at a time, let's talk about how do these values play out? What makes you want to climb the stairs 2 steps at a time? What makes you want to pull the sheet over your head and not get out of bed?
I'm a 2-step climber. That's great. So it's like restrained creativity in a way.
Yes, or actually, I think if you look at almost any creative activity, there's a great saying, and I don't remember who said it, but style is based on constraints. In other words, you're picking a lane, And for us, social and environmental responsibility in the production of the clothes places constraints that also, in some ways, create creative conditions, because you can't just follow what everybody else is doing.
Right.
You have to figure out what's going to work well within the aesthetic tradition of Patagonia and within the values that we've established.
It's this idea of diamonds are formed under pressure.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. In our previous episode, we talked to a couple of business owners, one of which kind of struggled with the one-for-one model. You donate an item based on, I guess, selling an item. So for one-for-one in that regard. But they sort of struggled with making it work as a business. You obviously want to fulfill a social mission, but at the same time, you have to keep the lights on. And so they were talking about how they've transitioned their social model over the years. And I know Patagonia has this 1% for the planet pledge, but you came to that in time. Can you talk about like the sort of evolution of Patagonia's sustainable model and how you've changed over the years?
In a nutshell, I think because we came out of making climbing gear, and the early employees were climbers and surfers, there was a commitment all along to this love of nature and wild places and a desire to protect it. So from the middle 1980s, we started giving 1% of sales for environmental causes. What took us longer to address was the social and environmental impact of the company itself. And that came about when we discovered, quite accidentally, we opened a store in Boston, using all of the latest low VOC paints and using recycled materials, nevertheless having to shut the store down after 3 days because employees were getting sick.
Oh, no.
And discovering from when we had the ventilation fix that the agent that was making people sick was formaldehyde off-gassing from cotton clothes stored in the basement, which then led us to investigate how cotton was grown, and we learned about the intensive use of chemicals and the damage to the workers from spraying, the fact that the soil takes 5 years to come back to produce any kind of life, or earthworms and plants 5 years after you stop spraying. And so we looked at this. This was the first time we said, okay, we don't grow cotton. We don't even own assembly factories. We certainly don't own mills, but we are responsible for this problem. Our products are contributing to this problem, and is there an alternative? And that's when we switched to organic cotton exclusively. And that was almost 30 years ago at this point. And that action led to subsequent action. I mean, we made it work. It wasn't easy.
You had to actually cultivate organic cotton producers, which maybe there weren't many at the time.
Well, there were. We thought that was a great idea. We'd buy from the farmers, but then we cut ourselves off from the global supply chain. So the farmers didn't know spinners, and so we had to go to the spinners, and they said, oh, we hate organic cotton. It gums up our machines. We didn't really know how to make clothes at that point. And by switching to organic cotton, we actually learned and experiencing the problems of trying to recreate a supply chain for ourselves, we actually learned how to make clothes.
Yeah.
And I think that the success of that inspired our employees, okay, what's the next step? The critical lesson in all this for us is, I think for a good 20 years, we were in the position that most companies that want to do the right thing find themselves in, which is this dilemma between pursuing profit or making a profit and doing the right thing. And the problem with that is, as businesses, is we have 700 years of accounting knowledge and practices versus 20 years of trying to figure out how to put numbers on the social and environmental impacts of our products. So what happens if you're making a choice is that nearly always the bottom line wins.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a danger you can quantify, whereas the advantages of doing the right thing socially or environmentally are not things that you can quantify. But what's happened to us in the last 10 or 12 years, and I think this is critical for B Corps and for other companies, is how do you operate the companies so that the business model is actually based on the values? So I mentioned a while back the constraints that we place ourselves. Well, all of these constraints have led to innovations that actually help identify the company. That's hugely different than making a compromise between purpose and profit. That's saying that, okay, our profits are going to be rooted in our purpose. We got into the food business in a small way about 10 years ago, and Patagonia Provisions, and had an interesting conversation with a fellow who's named Wes Jackson, who's run the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. And his life project has been to bring the Great Plains back to health. And the Great Plains had soil that ran several feet deep into the ground, and it's now 6 inches like every place else. And he was talking to us. He says, well, I developed this perennial wheatgrass called Kernza, and has roots that go several feet deep into the ground. And those roots reach out into the soil and disturb the microbes and fungi and actually create topsoil much faster than nature can. And he was telling us this, and we said, that sounds wonderful. Where can we buy some? And he said, oh, you can't buy Kernza. And we said, why not? He says, no one will plant it. No farmer is going to plant what they can't sell. So we contracted with a brewery in Portland, Oregon, to make a lager with Kernza as an ingredient. And we got the first 200 acres planted. And now we use it in a pasta. Major cereal companies have planted it to do a little carbon farming, because when you build topsoil, you can also draw carbon down into it. You can sequester carbon that we've lost the capacity to draw it down from cutting rainforests and from ocean acidification. So what this taught us is we said, okay, with provisions from now on, what we're going to do is that every new product has to solve a problem in the food system or in agriculture. So there's an alignment that means that the money that we make is related to this particular value.
Yeah. So in your book, The Responsible Company, you mentioned that Yvon Chouinard, Patagonia's founder, sharpened Patagonia's statement of purpose in around 2018. It was a result of being dismayed by the deepening climate crisis and the ineffective response from government and other businesses. Obviously, the government has a role to set regulations, but can you talk about the role businesses might play? And, to some degree, why did Yvon change the mission statement?
I think there were two reasons. The first is the sense of the environmental crisis intensifying, but not really being recognized. But also, I think because when we got into provisions, we started to understand that we could create a positive effect socially and environmentally. It wasn't just a question of reducing the harm we did, which has been the focus of the apparel company since the original mission statement we created in the 1990s. So we simplified the mission statement from build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. We simplified that to we're in business to save our home planet. I was skeptical at first. I thought this is highly aspirational language. Yes, that's a value of the company, but how central is that to us? But I think that it was a very grounding thing to do for the employees and for the company as a whole. And what I saw beyond my own skepticism about using this language is I saw the employees embrace it and to really ask themselves, okay, how does this affect my work? How does this affect how I work with my team and the products we produce?
So it became sort of like a fire in your belly kind of thing.
I think the lesson for us, and what I feel very strongly, and I put this in the book, is that businesses do have a really strong role to play. The environmental crisis is deeply entwined with the social crisis. And the solutions to both are the same. They tend to be the same thing. And to clean up the planet and to restore the health of communities requires the actions of government and civil society and of business. And the role business can play is that we are the most nimble force in society. We can deploy capital really efficiently, much more so than the government can. We can create enterprises that are self-sustaining. So you don't go to the government to raise taxes, and you don't go to rich people and foundations to reach into their pockets to support you. So there are a lot of things that business can do that are really needed. But at the same time, I think the responsibility of business is to look at what the products you're making, the services we're offering, and saying, is this really good for people and the planet? And you can at least make those products responsibly. You can clean up the mess that you create in the court. How are the workers treated in the plantations where it's cultivated? What happens what are the processes in the factories? Are those factories fired by coal? There are all kinds of things that businesses can investigate how things are made. And we have very deep supply chains, so a lot of companies don't know very much about how their things are made. So that's a long answer to your question, but yes, business has a role to play. It doesn't mean that we don't need a lot of action from governments.
So to what degree do you think that a business should set a purpose goal and maintain it in perpetuity? Like, is there ever a reason to augment or even eschew a purpose goal?
I think the purpose should be related to the products or services that you're offering. If your social and environmental actions are tangential to your business, I think it's very easy to give up.
Let's say the business isn't doing well, or you want to maintain a growth trajectory because you want to become a publicly traded company one day. And you have these pressures from, say, outside stakeholders, investors even. And so to some degree, you make the social mission and then you kind of change it because you are also responsible for these other stakeholders. Now, I'm going to give you an example. Sweetgreen recently made the decision to start adding steak to its menu. So Sweetgreen kind of rose in popularity because it's all about sustainable salads. Like, they were trying to make the supply chain for salads sustainable. And, they supported a lot of like upstart farmers and organic leafy green producers along the way. So to then start selling steak, which comes from New Zealand and Australia, by the way, is a change that seems significant. And to what degree, can you make that change as a business?
My first response would be, how are the animals treated? What are the grazing practices? But those would be my questions. And I think a lot of their customers would say, well, we signed on to this to get plants. And what are we doing here? I think that that's a real question for that company, whether to change to add meat to its offerings. And I think that that's a question that should involve all of its stakeholders, who would include the investors, the employees, the customers, with entrepreneurs who say, I want to get started in a business, and after 5 years, I'll become a good guy, Then I'll start to do the right thing and give 1% for the planet. And I think that that's kind of a mistake. And it's more or less the path we went down. We didn't consciously do that, but when we started in the 70s, there really wasn't a sense of businesses disciplining themselves. It was more like, okay, the government sets the rules and we follow them. I think that it's almost like, when you're young, if you open up a savings account when you're making a minimum wage and you just put in automatically a certain percentage, you never think about it. And after a while, you've got a nice pot of money. And I think that for companies that start out, to do the right thing from the beginning builds practices that you're not even aware what a difference that's making in your organization until a few years later you look back and say, hey, we're very different from our competitors because we followed this path. The other thing is, I think it's a shock. If you decide to become a good guy after 5 years, you've got to deal with your investors and your employees and your customers who are all surprised. If a salad company all of a sudden starts selling meat, well, that's a big surprise. If they had defined at the beginning that they were going to pursue certain kinds of agricultural practices and whatever they did would fall into that mode, that might be a different story. I also think it's really important for entrepreneurs starting out to tell the same story to each of their stakeholders. You don't tell your investors, well, I don't really mean all this stuff I'm saying in my market. The investor should understand what the trajectory, what the values of the company are, and what you want to build.
Yeah, I love the idea of building social equity.
Yeah. if you say the same thing for a long time, over time you build trust.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't build trust. And trust is, for branded merchandise, is a pretty major business asset.
Absolutely.
You're a growing business, which means you need every spare hour you can find. That's why the most successful, growing businesses are working together in Slack. Slack is where work happens, with all your people, data, and information in one AI-powered place. Start a call instantly in huddles and ditch cumbersome calendar invites. Or build an automation with Workflow Builder to take routine tasks off your plate. No coding required. Grow your business in Slack. Visit slack.com to get started.
That's significant. So, and this is also interesting. Yvonne Chouinard in the Pages of Ink had once said, something to the effect of, every time I've made a decision that's best for the planet, I've made money.
Yeah.
And that's intriguing to me because it's almost like it's basically doubling down on what you just said. It's like you have the purpose,
Yeah.
but at the same time, that shouldn't be in contrast to, having a good business too. And they shouldn't be warring opposites.
Absolutely.
Can we do it together? Yeah.
And I think if you believe in the capacities of business and you're not cynical about them, I think it follows that. I mean, when Evil says that, he says it wistfully. He's kind of always surprised that happens.
He strikes me as a wistful guy. Yeah.
And I think that the reason we make money is that we further differentiate ourselves from our competition. We earn the trust and the loyalty of our customers. So,
well, you're also making good products.
Yeah.
I mean, you're trying to make products that are built to last.
That's a critical element.
Right. And so
it really is.
Yeah.
It's even more critical than your social and your environmental footprint. Because if you're making, I remember being at a conference with the head of Seventh Generation, and someone from the audience raised their hand and said, "I've been using your products since before they were." And we have our own experience with this in the early 2000s, making a line of eco rain shelves that were noisy and ugly, and they didn't keep you dry. So we realized, okay, they're environmentally better, but all we're doing is setting customers against clothes with environmental claims. So for one thing, durability and high quality is a key element to environmental responsibility.
Mm-hmm. And
for another, the world doesn't need a lot of more crappy products. And the fact that you get 2 crappy products instead of 1 is not is not really a great advantage.
Right. They don't cancel each other out. Yeah. And then have you had any challenges with meeting social goals?
Oh, yes.
Over the years?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, when a company pursues environmental and social improvements, a lot of times the environmental improvements will actually save you money. You're buying less water, you're paying for fewer removals of trash, you're buying less energy. Social innovations often require more money. Mm-mm. And it's harder for businesses to look at the return on increasing the amount of money you spend on social. But Tenzie Whalen at NYU did some interesting work a few years ago, arguing, and I'm not sure how much she argued for this, but I would argue for it, is that we need to look at these as investments rather than just increases in expenses. Mm-hmm. An example is we subsidize childcare. We have on-site childcare, and we've had it for 30 years. It costs us a fortune if you look at it on paper. But we get a 30% tax credit. We have levels of engagement that are off the charts. We have almost no turnover among working parents who have kids in the childcare program. And so when we looked at that, the fortune that we were spending on childcare all of a sudden became we looked at it's either an expense of $15,000 or we're making $45,000 on it. We're not sure, right? Depending on how you look at it. So I think, and especially with the supply chain, it's a challenge because we're dealing with workers who are not your employees in countries where you are not present 100% of the time. A few years ago, we had to pull out of Western China because of the way the Uyghurs are treated. And we were getting very high quality cotton from Xinjiang province, but we withdrew because we were no longer allowed to audit the working conditions because the government wouldn't let us. So their challenge, years ago, we've been auditing assembly factories for years, and then we audited mills for the first time and found indentured servitude, and
Wow.
had to work with the mills and the government to figure out how to change that. So it's constant.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are great examples. So flash forward to 2022
Yeah.
when the Yvonne and the rest of the Chenards had a massive announcement
Yeah.
for everybody. So basically the company decided to go purpose instead of, say going public. The, idea is giving 98% of the company to a nonprofit and, the 2% of the shares, the voting shares over to a trust. So can you walk us through what it was like to be at the company at that point and, how integral were you into the process?
Well, I wasn't integral to the process, but I'd had conversations with Yvonne 15 years earlier about succession.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, earlier, he wanted to basically have Patagonia owned by a foundation, and it wasn't possible until a few years ago. So instead, it's the primary reason we became a B Corp was to be able to legally incorporate our most deeply held values into our business charter and create a situation where if stock in the company was ever sold, whoever bought in would have to buy into these values.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also true that the adult children of the Chenards, who both work at the company, didn't really want to inherit it. They didn't want the responsibility of, it's quite a burden actually for a family to feel the responsibility for thousands of employees on 3 different continents. And it felt right, and especially in line with the new mission statement of we're in business to save our home planet, to specifically create a structure that supported that. So the profits of the company, part of them are reinvested in the company, and part of them are become bonuses or distributed as bonuses for employees and when times are good.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of the profits are now dedicated to larger scale environmental projects that we couldn't engage in before.
Mm-hmm.
Patagonia as a company still gives 1% of its sales aside from the profits that go into are distributed by Holdfast.
The pledge still stands.
Yeah.
Right. To what degree has Patagonia been successful? How do you even measure success when you have like a triple bottom line?
I think that the success and the challenges both are ongoing. I'm rather amazed knowing that company as I do, the people, the market we're in. I'm amazed at the things that we've been able to do. If you'd asked in the 1990s if we could accomplish some of the changes we've made in the supply chain, if we could make life more equitable for our employees, if we could create certain kinds of innovations and products, if we could take a culture, a very sort of freewheeling, lovely culture of this very small company from the 1970s, and still have it be dynamic and committed 40 years or 50 years later when you've got thousands of employees, I would have said, no, I don't think that's possible. I don't think that there's success is never final unless a company is no longer in existence.
Yeah, I guess so.
But I think we're most successful
Mm-hmm.
when we're like any other company operating on, I hate to use a fossil fuel metaphor, but on all cylinders, in which everybody's committed to making great product, everybody's committed to the environmental values of reducing our harm or doing positive good, and having a good time. I think that would define success for us. And most of the time we're successful.
Well, that sounds great. Vincent, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
That's all for today's episode of From the Ground Up.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice. Also, if you liked today's episode or have suggestions of what topics you'd like to hear about, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or reach out to us on Inc.'s social channels on LinkedIn, TikTok, or Instagram.
From the Ground Up is produced by Julia Hsu, Blake Odom, and Avery Miles. Mix and sound design by Nicholas Torres. Our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.